Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Alright, so this evening we're going to go ahead and try to achieve this paint job, which is just a desert camouflage. Some grays, browns, and some yellows. So the process I used for that involves about 9 paints, 8 if you count the wash. Go over those colors real quick. Let me go over the base colors first here. Got Master Series Dusky Skin, Master Series Terran Khaki, and Game Color Vallejo Game Color Plague Brown. In addition to that, for the base work, I've got Game Color Earth. We'll be using Army Painter Soft Tone and Model Color Glaze Medium. And then for the highlights, some of the mixes, all Vallejo, but Game Color Pale Yellow, Game Color Ghost Gray, and Model Color Light Flesh. For brushes, I've got, I guess it's a Low Cornell number 1. These are my cheap brushes, a no-name brand number 4 for most of the big work. And then I've got a Winsor Newton Series 7.0 and a Recab Kalinsky 000. They're very similar, but one has a better point than the other, so you might see me switch between those. Got some distilled water, some regular water, soap, all that good stuff. I've also got a dropper bottle full of alcohol for cleanup and things like that. Alright, so first things first, shake up your paint, and we're going to go ahead and start with the base coats. I primed it in gray. Originally, when the first color I did, I primed it with green, and then I did a white Zenith prime. Ended up, because I was going to do something different, ended up completely wiping over it with the base coat, so it was completely moot. But gray or white, probably pretty safe to use since these are lighter colors. Alright, so I'm going to use some Terran Khaki. I'm going to thin that down. So I'm just using my thin paint to do a nice even base coat. I'm not gonna do half the pattern and then try to spiral the pattern here. I'm just gonna get this thin brown on first, because what it's gonna do, it's a light color, so the plague brown that we're gonna put over the top will have no problems going over this. If we were using a white or a yellow or something like that, we definitely want to be more considerate of whether or not the paint was going to block or darken that shade or make it difficult to coat over it. So just being very liberal with the paint. It's thin. I can see the original gray underneath the color of the model there. So I'm not looking to get one just solid coat of coverage. And the nice thing about this is with the gray underneath this light brown is it really won't be a detriment to the model and the overall color, because when we go to that wash, it's going to darken this khaki and it's going to basically make that primer color disappear, and anything that is showing through will end up looking a little bit lighter in a similar fashion to the color palette that we're using, so you really shouldn't notice it at all if there is any. And then of course when we do our highlights, there's plenty of opportunity to touch it up. So if you're base coating and you're worried about, oh, I've got to get every little spot to look the exact way the color looks in the dish, or once you think it's dry and coated and nice and even, that's not necessarily always true. When you thin your paint, can have a tendency to leave little bubbles and pool in areas, so that's why I'm periodically kind of going around and just double checking any areas that I've done before to look for pooling. It's not because I'm scatterbrained and have to paint a different spot the whole time. It's just I'm keeping myself engaged with the fact that there is probably going to be a spot or two where there might be some bubbles or anything like that that I might have missed. Also, when I see a little area that maybe the paint looked like it went on, but paint has a unique way of not always going the exact place where you thought it went, and I'm just making those little touch-ups as I go just to try to get a good solid coat despite it being thin. And again, you can always go back and touch this up. So alright, Plague Brown. So for instance, if can't really see that as well, but this out of the bottle for me, this mix right here is very thin, so I'm probably not going to thin it much, but you can see that that's the consistency it came out of the bottle in, so it's fairly thin already. And I don't want it too thin because now I'm doing a stripe pattern, so I don't want it to run and go places I don't want it to go. Let's see how that does. Switching over to this is a one-liner brush, I guess. Let's see how it looks on the foot, because that's easy to fix. Move the camera here. Yeah, I think that'll work. So I wouldn't go much thinner than that, just because otherwise it'll wick and capillary through the cracks and crevices, and you'll have color where you don't necessarily want it. Where's the fun in that? I don't have any specific pattern in mind. I'm just doing some obscuring stripes just to kind of break up the pattern of the miniature. Yep. Oh yeah. Moment. You don't have to be super careful when you're putting these on here because, well, let me caveat that. So the pattern is this Plague Brown and the Khaki, and then we're going to take them up. But if you look, you can see I've got a dividing line between the two to give that pop to both colors. It really sets off the gray, and it really subdues the yellow and brown, orange color. And the color we're going to do for that. So that's where you really need to be careful, but the line between the two, it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, it doesn't have to be perfectly round. If you get a little jagged here and there, you're going to be able to fix that with the dusky gray that we're going to put in between the two of these. So now I'm just going to snake this line however I am able, just to kind of add some nice variety. And you don't have to make them continuous. You can do, you know, something more like stripes or whatever. It's, you know, it's camouflage. You can do whatever you want. It's 30-foot tall tank. Not particularly using a lot of paint either. I'm just kind of getting my brush a little, it's probably too close. There we go. Back to focus. I'm just getting it a little bit loaded, not super heavy like I was base coating, but not so small like I would be trying to detail. I'm just going around looking for areas that I think might be too wide or too narrow. Touch them up now. Okay. So now we're going to take Reaper Dusky Skin, which is essentially kind of it's like a brownish gray. I think it's a gray with a little bit of like violet in it, but I really like the color. Yeah, it's a dark gray with a bit of violet in it, I think. This, though, we're going to want thin down, and again, not too thin because we don't want it to run into the cracks, because that's what's going to tie our stripes together. So I'm going to switch over to my Winsor & Newton. Added about 2 drops of water to that. You can see that. No, it's not in focus now, but fairly consistent as far as the consistency of the paints that I'm using. I'm gonna release the soap off my brush here. Sure it's clean. All right. See how this looks. So now all I'm doing is I'm just picking the line between the two. Just going to tie them together. Trying to keep it as narrow as possible, but I'm not overly concerned if it gets a little bit wide, because again, we're going to touch up both colors, so there's an opportunity on either side of each color to give just a little bit of a nudge in the direction you want it to go. And it doesn't have to be consistent on the opacity either, so if you put a little thin here and a little bit thicker there, it's camouflage, so again, it's super forgiving as far as making it look good and break up the lines. Alright, so now we've got the Quickshsde soft tone that we're going to just use directly from the bottle. You shouldn't have to thin it. We're just going to put it on nice and heavy, and it's going to help merge these colors together and give us a nice shade, and then sink into all the recesses and give us a good shadow and contrast. I'm using my heavier number 4 brush here to wash. Holds a lot more of the wash on the brush. I like to start at the top. Gravity's going to take some of that wash and pull it down as you let it sit and rest, so instead of having it pool up at the feet, I like to start at the top and then work it down as I go. Kind of minimizes the amount of cleanup and brushing away of the excess. I'm just trying to get it directed into all the recesses. I'm not being particular. It's just a complete total coverage wash. We want the entire thing to be completely covered and help change the tone of the brown and the khaki. Alright, so once you've finished, take a look around your entire miniature and make sure there's no spots that you might have missed under the arms or in a recessed area, kind of underneath between the legs, things like that, where you might have just not gotten all the wash to cover that surface area. And then just look around and try and find areas that maybe it might have pooled up a little too much. Just use your brush to wick away some of the excess. You can use a paper towel that you're using. And then once you've got it where you feel you're happy with it, some areas might be dark, you want darker or not as dark, you can add or move the material around. Then just make sure you let it sit and dry completely. Alright, so now we're going to take the Terran Khaki and we're going to add a drop of Vallejo Glaze Medium. I like to start out with a 1:1 ratio. Sometimes I might have to add a little bit of water, depending on the thickness of the paint. The glaze medium is going to act as a retarder for the drying time on the paint, which will give you time to work the panel that you're applying it to and allow your brush to pull and maneuver the paint on whatever particular area you're trying to layer, so that you can catch those edges or move some more of the paint on one side or the other of the panel that you're working with. So this first layer, when we do the Terran Khaki, you're really going to want to just try to cover the majority of the panel that you're highlighting. You're not trying to keep too much of that darker shade around. It will, naturally kind of sit on the edges that you don't work the paint out to. But as you take your brush and start to maneuver the paint to one edge or another, you can leave a little more of that paint on one side, and as it dries with the slow drying glaze medium, then it will start to show a gradient, and you'll start to see where the higher side, if you've left paint up on that edge, as you should try to do if you want to do a higher source of light. But what it's going to do as it dries is it will start to show a gradient, even though you didn't really do anything as far as an actual blend. This layer is going to do the work for you. So as you'll see here, I'm just trying to hit at least the start of the high points where I want to have a little bit extra paint, and then I start to basically work over the entire panel, knowing that I've got just a little bit extra on that high side. And throughout this demo, you'll see I'll go back after I've seen that the paint is a little bit drier, and I will try to touch those areas a little bit more on the high side. If you try to work with the paint before it's really dried enough, what can end up happening is your brush will move some of that paint as it's still drying, and you'll end up with these ridges and tide marks where the partially dried lighter color will reveal the darker color underneath it, and then it's just going to take a lot of more work to get that back. Then you have to wait for it to dry again completely, and then you got to put dabs of paint on that area. You can smooth it out, it's not the end of the world, but it's just more work and it takes more time. So just be patient, work on one area, and then pick another spot on the miniature, and then go back to that area after it's dried for a significant amount of time, and you shouldn't encounter that issue. Remember that the paint here should be fairly thin. You do want a gradual change. If your paint is too thick, you're going to get all that opacity, and it's going to contrast more than what you want. If you're going for that look, that's fine, but that's really not what we're trying to do with this camouflage. We want that semi-opacity because as we bring that paint closer to the division line, that darker dusky gray, what that'll do is the dark underneath will show through some of the transparency of the khaki glaze that we're using, and then you get those soft transition lines to where it looks more like it's been spray painted. I won't say airbrush because that's a really difficult effect to do, but you do get a nice blurred or kind of a less defined line, which is really a good thing when it comes to camouflage. So if you're noticing that it's kind of going on real thick, you know, start thinner. If it's going on too thin or it's running, obviously that's too thin, but you know, it'll take some practice. But once you get familiar with your particular paint and your particular mix, you'll start to see how those transitions will come to pass. And really, a lot of it comes down to just having the paint mixed in the right ratio at the right consistency, and then the rest of it is just putting it in that one little spot it needs to be. It's not super technical, it's all technique. So play around with your paint, you know, practice on the base if you need to, if you're not sure, if you want to test it out. You'll see me every now and then, I'll wipe some paint off on my hand because maybe my brush is a little too heavily loaded. I also want to see what that color might look like as well, and skin is actually a really good indicator of what it'll look like. Plus I have that light source right there and it doesn't make a mess on anything else, so just keep that in mind. This step will take some time. Be patient, stick with it. It'll look really good, I promise. By the time you get all those little individual areas, a spot of the lighter color to give that initial start of contrast and transition. So trust me, it's a bit daunting. There's a lot of work to put into it, but after a while you start to get pretty good. You can start to move a little faster and you know, hit certain areas a little bit more here and there, and you get a good feel for it. So with practice, I'm sure you'll get better. So I'll just continue to skip ahead on this and we'll get to the next step with the brown. Alright, so now we're going to start with a glaze of the original Plague Brown. Again, I've mixed it with 1 drop of glaze medium to 1 drop of paint. I might have needed to add a little bit of water to the paint, but again, your results will vary depending on the initial thickness and consistency of whatever paint colors you're using. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing I've done with the khaki, only now I'm just going to highlight the brown areas. Also, if you'll notice, I'm using about a 45-degree angle, and I'm not using the tip of my brush so much as the edge or the side, if you will, of the brush. That allows me to pick out those raised edges when there's small areas and I maybe don't necessarily want to try to drag the brush and do a line. That way I get a little bit more control. I still get the same result as that edge gets highlighted. Alright, so now I've done some of the Plague Brown highlights in this arm area here where I'm kind of focusing the work and showing you the techniques. I've kept that khaki damp. I've just had to periodically add a little bit of water here and there, and because of that and the glaze medium in there, it's still very usable paint. So now I'm just going to add about a 50-50 ratio of Vallejo light flesh to the paint, and that's going to be our next step in layering on the khaki color. So I don't think I'm going to need to add any more glaze medium, but if you notice it's maybe getting dry or it's not quite the consistency that you're happy with, you know, feel free to add a little more. It's really up to you. Plus, depending on what type of glaze medium you're using, that might also differ a little bit. So I'm just going to get it mixed up nice and well, and as long as it's not chunky and there's not little bits of stuff in there, then feel free to use it. Now if it's dried out to the point where you're going to get contaminants and things like that on your miniature and all over your brush, just start over. So now I'm just using the same techniques as before, just with the 50-50 mix, and I'm just putting less paint on the same panels. So now as that dark to mid-tone and now to our light tone will start to occur naturally, as long as I keep the translucency and the consistency of the paint fairly consistent, then the coverage shouldn't differ too much and you shouldn't see any hard lines or any strong transitions, and it shouldn't just look like a basic unthinned or right out of the bottle type of paint going on. It should have some nice gradient to it, even though you're really not trying to feather it out or do anything advanced at this particular stage. I'm just going to take my time, work slowly, and pick out those higher edge details, places where the light really would get caught, sharp edges, top sides of any sort of panels or armor, even weapons if that's what you're painting with the same color. So I'm just looking for those high edges, and as you can see, I'm just again using either the tip of my brush as I bring the paint down, or I'm using the 45 on the side of my brush there to really just catch the edge of those panels without breaking into the recesses or catching something I don't intend to. So, and if I make a mistake, the nice thing is with that glaze medium is that the paint is still workable. So you can either have another brush with water that you can keep damp, and then you can wipe that paint or move it a little bit. You can use Q-tips. You can even use your finger. I don't recommend doing that too often because you can maybe mess up other areas because it's not as precise. But a mistake here, especially with glaze medium, is really not a mistake unless you let it dry completely. And even then, you can always go back to that normal khaki mid-tone and touch it up again and work it back up. Now getting back into that dark area, because we use the wash, that will be a little bit more difficult, but again, not impossible, because I'm going to use a wash at the end of this to go back and maybe touch up areas where I got a little paint in a place I didn't want, or it's not quite as dark or as much contrast as I'd like, and that's perfectly a good time to find those areas that you maybe had a little bit too much highlighting, or it's maybe a little brighter than you wanted it to be. So don't get hung up on one little area. It's a very dynamic situation. It's fluid. Just be accepting of the fact that you can have some mistakes up until the very end when you stop painting, and there's really nothing to get too concerned with because of the ease of the colors that we're using. They're easily repeatable, so you don't have to try and get a certain type of mix. It's just out of the bottle, either a dark wash to shade, or adding 50% of a lighter color to get that highlight. Alright, so now we've completed our gray highlight. Now we're going to get our brown highlight using pale yellow. So again, a 50-50 mix with the plague brown, keeping the previous color if you haven't taken too much of a break and the paint's still viable. If you just add a drop of water to as you work, it should stay fine. And then just adding an even amount into the mix, and we're doing the exact same thing we did before, just with the opposite color. Alright, so now that we're done with the 50-50 highlight with the pale yellow added to the plague brown, you can see how it looks with the khaki highlighted with the light flesh tone. And now when we compare the two between what we're going for on the Hunchback, you can see they're starting to get very, very similar. The only difference right now is that the Hunchback has a ghost gray highlight added to those khaki highlights to really make them pop. And if you wanted to, you could even add a little bit of that pale yellow to make a little bit more of those browns pop as well. Alright, here I'm going to show you how to use the ghost gray to highlight the khaki. I'm just going to run a simple little bit of water thin into the ghost gray. If you want to use glaze medium on your own just to be consistent with the paint that you've been using before, that's perfectly fine. By all means do that. I'm just comfortable using the thinned ghost gray with water for this particular step. You probably noticed that the entire miniature now has the highlights all over the khaki as well as the plague brown. So I just wanted to let you know that I did skip ahead and complete the miniature, and now I'm just going on to those extreme highlights. So now I'm just picking out the areas where a highlighted edge would be appropriate. So looking from the top down, I'm just kind of picking out things that would catch most of the light and trying to at least get that top edge. It's not the end of the blend that I'm going to do, but it's a start so that I kind of know those are my save points, if you will, on where to go back and maybe add a little bit of paint and drag it downward to simulate that highlighted effect. You see me might use my finger every now and then to maybe smudge or even clean up a certain area. I try not to do that too often, but every now and then it does happen, especially if I'm putting something into a recessed area and I get it on the outer edge, then it's a quick way to clean up. Oftentimes though, I will use my brush with water to clean up or to work some paint out of an area where I didn't want it. But now you can see I'm just using the side of my brush with the thinned paint, and I'm starting to work some of those details and highlights and try to prevent the brush from going where I don't want it to go. That's the biggest thing you need to remember when you're trying to detail paint like this, is you spend all your time working on this model. You've got all these colors laid down, and now you just want to put just the slightest bit of paint in certain areas to accent all the great work that you've done so far. So what I'm doing is just going areas where I'm comfortable, that I can reach them quickly, the ones that are easy to spot, and then as I progress I'll start to kind of get to some of the harder, more difficult areas and maybe take more time. But as you can see, I'm working fairly quickly, not because I'm in a hurry, but simply because they're easy to highlight and it's easy areas that'll take paint quickly. And even often, sometimes you'll even see me take the brush and almost dry brush, if you will, in that motion where I'm just quickly flicking the brush over some of the raised edges. Especially, you'll probably see me do that down on the feet. Not because I'm trying to cut steps, but really I just don't need to spend too much time there, because I do plan on doing some maybe weathering effects on the feet, but that doesn't mean that you can't do that in other areas where, you know, like especially like the rippled areas or with small recesses like you can see on the missile pods. I'll just do an up and down motion with my brush about 45 degrees, so I know the tip of the brush isn't going to get in between those recesses, but it's going to highlight those outer edges. I don't have to spend time just, you know, slowly lining and edging. But, you know, save time and effort where you can, but there are areas where you do need to, you know, take your time and slow down and pick out certain areas that do need a little bit more attention and or maybe hard to reach. So you'll see I've also got some of my other paint available to me still in the palette there. That's for if you need to touch up, or maybe you notice an area that you missed on either the khaki or on the brown that you just, might as well utilize that time there while you catch it to fix it. Especially if you're working with slow dry or retarder or glaze medium, you do have plenty of time with that paint to still be plenty workable. You might have to add a little bit of water here and there to keep the consistency, but it will definitely dry slower, so it's very useful. Or if you're using a wet palette, then of course you have that ready available as well. But I don't try to clean out all the paints that I might be using, especially on a step like this where either I might make a mistake or I'll catch something that I might have missed in the previous step that just got by me. So just keep that in mind as a little trick, so you don't have to keep repouring and mixing paint and getting, going back and forth. So here now I'm taking the model and I'm just looking straight down, and I'm going what was going to catch the harsh edge lights if there was a overhead illumination, and I just want to hit those yet again just to make sure that they get a good accent, or I guess in this case over accent, to really pronounce the it's not really a true blend, but this blend of layers, I should say, technique that gives the appearance of a blend, but doesn't require the technical skill of using multiple brushes and things like that, which I'll demonstrate at some point later on. But this was just a way that yielded a very nice result and didn't require nearly as much work with 2 or 3 color blends and multiple brushes and so on. Now I'm just picking out areas where I want a little bit more of that top-down detail. And as I was looking at this, I started noticing, especially on that front grille section and a few other areas, where they should have been either dark, or I might have gotten some paint here or there. And then I decided to add, or to go back and use some of these Army Painter soft tone to redefine and re-establish some of those shaded areas. And you can use it as a shader too. So we did that coverage wash to get all that detail and all those recessed areas nice and darkened, and show the shadows and the lightened areas. And then of course you can go back at any time and use that as a spot touch-up. And now if you put a bright color paint in the recesses, it's not just going to cover that up. So just keep that in mind, that you might want to go back to one of the base colors or a slightly darker version of that, or even a darker brown, and then put the color in there or something along that line. But if you catch it quick enough and you clean most of it out, or brush most of it out, then when you go and touch up with a little bit of a wash, then you're eliminating the error, and you're also reestablishing that nice recessed detail that makes the miniature pop and gives that depth. Now I'm inspecting the miniature and looking for areas that I really want to maybe detail or add some area of wash that either didn't get as much of a dark tone, or that I might have mistakenly put paint somewhere. So shaking up that Army Painter soft tone. I don't need a whole lot of it. It's really just a touch up. So no need to go and pour a bunch of it unless you're doing multiple models. So I'm just using it right out of the bottle. I'm not even thinning it, and now I'm picking out those areas that either have like an overhang, or is a deep recessed area like the parts in between the torso there, where I know there's not really going to be a lot of light. And I might have reached in there with the brush and highlighted the panel, but now I want to kind of unhighlight some of it and make a nice subdued transition. Some of these panel lines here on the front didn't get as much as dark as I would have liked, either because of the angle that they're at, wept down, or perhaps the orange got a little bit into the recesses as it was too thinned. Here's that grill section I was talking about. I'm using a vertical stroke. I'm not trying to actually put paint on the high raised surface, and that's an area where if I did, I would quickly take either my finger or something along that and just kind of quickly brush it downward or brush it away. See, I've made a mistake there on the leg where it kind of got a little bit on the raised panel. So if you see something like that and you act quickly, you can undo the error very quickly. So now I'm just picking out areas where maybe I want to re-accentuate, maybe not a mistake necessarily, or the underside for these missile pods. They're going to be darker, so that little bit of over highlight, if it's past the midpoint, then really that's not the way it would normally look. And then I'm just hitting the missile tubes as well, because they're going to get carbon buildup later, so I'm just going to keep those dark. But I'm just getting all those underside overhangs and areas like that where the natural light probably wouldn't be unless there was some sort of other illumination going along. If you want to touch up joints, or if you have visible hip sections and elbow joints and things like that you maybe didn't want to put camouflage on, this would be a good time as well to go and either touch those up or to put your last bit of paint on. So I'm just picking out some of those areas along the legs. But no, you're going to have like oil or grit, or just aren't going to have a whole lot of light exposed. Here I'm looking down and I see just a few little ridged areas that maybe just need a little bit of darker tone, and it will undo some of those real extreme highlights. So you kind of need to use it sparingly, but the details on these barrels especially, I want those lines to be there, otherwise it just kind of looks like it's all, you know, smeared together. So I'm willing to just carefully go and try to put those between the lines, and if it means I got to go back and put a little dot of paint here or there, that's fine, but I really want those details to show up. So yes, you might be backtracking slightly here and there, but if it's something that bothers you, and it bothered me enough obviously to touch this up, so if it is bothering you, or you know, it's something that you want to maybe make it look a little bit better, then you know, you can easily do that, and it's not going to change a whole lot of the colors, and if anything, it's going to give you even a better transition from the dusky gray transition between the gray and the brown. So it'll actually make it look even more blended. Again, with just layering, we're not doing actual on the miniature blending. Just a few more spots to touch up, and the miniature is finished up to my liking. I'm just going to let this dry, and that is how I do this particular desert camouflage scheme. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you learned something, and I hope to see your comments and questions. If you've got one that you've done your own, I'd love to see it. Please follow us on Camo Specs on the YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch TV. There's a side-by-side comparison. Still a little bit more to go, maybe with some yellow, but overall I'm very happy with the result. Thanks a lot, I appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Shutdown sequence initiated.